Andy has had a long career working with the BC Forest Service and afterwards playing an absolutely critical role in forest conservation in the province, both in terms of protecting old growth forests, but also working with changing and improving forest practices, increasing people's awareness of biodiversity issues all around the province. And he's had an important role in almost every important conservation issue in the province in the last 30 or 40 years. And we're super lucky to have him around. After leaving government, he then became a local politician. He was on council in Metchosin for several terms and narrowly avoided being mayor there. And it continues to be super involved in other conservancies on Vancouver Island, and a whole bunch of more interesting conservation-oriented activities than I can name. He's a huge, precious resource that we have in the province, and it's super exciting to have him here to tonight talk about the natural and cultural history of magic mushrooms in British Columbia.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, and thank you everybody for the invitation tonight. I was offered a microphone, but I prefer to work without one. Can everybody hear me loud enough?
Yeah. Good.
Okay. All right. Didn't wear my voice out during the foray today when we had, how many people did we have there? That was like 60 maybe.
Wow.
It was a lot of fun. I offered Ken a number of topics that I could discuss, and this was the one that he selected.
It was a committee decision.
I was a little concerned that bringing a talk about magic mushrooms to Lasqueti Island was a Coles to Newcastle kind of thing. But I agreed, and this is a talk that I've given a couple of times before, but it's always different because I can never remember how it goes. But I'm going to talk about natural history for the first part of the talk, and then I'm going to delve more into the cultural history of magic mushrooms in British Columbia. It's something that I lived through part of. It's something that I suppose I was peripherally involved in part of. And it's certainly something I'm aware of because anytime I go anywhere else in Canada and I explain to them what I do, they go, "Oh, British Columbia, true." This is the book. Thank you very much for your bids on the book. I'm glad that we can provide that kind of support to Link, which is an organization that does great work and is certainly deserving of our support. I was very happy to do the Mushroom Guide in the Royal BC Museum Handbook series because for a lot of biologists in British Columbia, including myself, these were the books that we grew up with. The museum handbooks covering a wide range of different organisms. And in fact, they have produced two previous Mushrooms of British Columbia works. One in 1946 by George Hardy, and one in 1964, and later on in 76 by Robert Bandoni and Adam Shabinsky. There's a lot of funny things about these two. I won't delve into it, except to say that Robert Bandoni, the lead author of the 1964 book, was my master's supervisor at UBC from 1979 to 1982. and also to let you know how long ago that was. Because the last revision was in 1976. And just to give you an idea, that was the first handbook produced by the Royal British Columbia Museum that featured the remarkable innovation, color photographs. This was a little while ago. Hardy's book was about 90 pages with about 50 species. The Bandoni book was about 170 pages with 150 species. And so we produced our book, which has about 350 species described and maybe another 600 mentioned, and is about 520 pages, I think. So they've been getting bigger as we've learned more about the mushrooms of British Columbia, and also probably because I seem incapable of writing a short book. The main reason I did the book was so I could put a picture of my granddaughter in there. This is Margaret, and just so you don't think it's entirely gratuitous, which would not be beyond me, because I love my granddaughter so much, she is sitting on a red belt cock. So tonight's talk is actually by myself and Paul Kruger, who is a good friend. He and I were up on Cortes Island last week, having a lot of fun. And if you'd like more information about magic mushrooms in British Columbia, have a look at the Vancouver Mycological Society website for an article he wrote about magic mushrooms in BC. There will be a lot more information about what I'm talking about tonight. This is kind of what we look like today, Paul and I, but we haven't always looked like this. There's a picture from 1980 when Paul and I decided to go on a Pilts Creek across southern British Columbia to collect fungi for the herbarium. And I guess we looked a little bit different then. Let's see.
Yeah.
Oh. No, pretty much the same. Not much changed. BC is a remarkable place. There are more. This shows a series of kind of southeast to northwest trending mountain ranges from the Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii ranges all the way to the Rocky Mountains that create an incredible diversity of climates, that create an incredible diversity of ecosystems in British Columbia. By a lot of measures, British Columbia would be perhaps the most ecologically diverse jurisdiction worldwide at temperate latitudes. It's an incredible area to be a biologist. It's got more types of just about any other organism you can think of, bats, birds, plants, than any other province or territory in Canada. Ecosystems. I worked for many years developing this ecosystem classification of the province. So the topographic diversity that we have in British Columbia yields climatic diversity. We have the wettest, driest, warmest, and some of the coldest areas in Canada in British Columbia. The climatic diversity yields ecological diversity, which results in an incredible species diversity. So I've got here more than 3,420 species of macrofungi. You could think 3 species of mushrooms, if you like. Okay? We're now up over 3,500, and I suspect there are probably on the order of 10,000 species of mushrooms in British Columbia, which would indicate that, in all likelihood, 2/3 of them have yet to be discovered. There will be species of mushrooms new to science on Lasqueti Island. Guaranteed. Right? So that's one of the fun things about working with fungi, is that there's so much that's not known compared to, say, plants or animals. But of the 3,420 recorded mushroom species, a small number of them are hallucinogenic. I've got a picture of probably the most famous one here, Liberty caps, which is a beautiful mushroom, you must admit. And I'm going to now review a number of these different species of psilocybe and some related genera that contain psilocybin. We were foraying last week with one of the most famous students of psychoactive mushrooms on planet Earth, whose name is Paul Stamets. And he's working on a new paper about the number of mushroom species that contain psilocybin. And it's way higher than anybody ever thought, which is fascinating. So I'm waiting to see what comes of that. This is the iconic magic mushroom of British Columbia. We were holding a mock contest to choose a provincial mushroom for British Columbia. And for a lot of people, this was their choice. It grows from dead grass roots and is especially common in wet pastures where the grass roots will oftentimes die from submersion and create a heavy thatch. So despite what some people joke about, this isn't a mushroom that grows from dung. It thrives in grazed fields, not associated with dung. You can also find it in lawns and playing fields, primarily in wet coastal areas. And it's likely introduced to British Columbia through agriculture. I guess that's one reason why it wouldn't make a truly great provincial mushroom, because it's introduced.
Where did it come from?
It's a European species. Even the name Liberty cap is a very fun name. It was initially a hat that was given to freed Roman slaves, and in order to invoke that imagery, when Julius Caesar was murdered by Marcus Brutus in 44 BC, Brutus had these coins minted showing how Caesar was killed and the liberation that comes with the Liberty cap. They had Liberty caps in the French Revolution. And Liberty caps also in the American Revolution. Illustrated them at least. And they show up also in poetry and prose from 1803, whose tapering stems, I've illustrated it with Psilocybe semilanciata here, the Liberty cap, whose tapering stems, robust or light, like columns catch the searching sight, to claim remark where'er I roam, supporting each a shapely dome. Like fair umbrellas, furled or spread, display their many-colored head, gray, purple, yellow, white, or brown, shaped like war's shield or prelate's crown, like freedom's cap, or friar's cowl, or China's bright inverted bowl. Or from 1812, in a great book, Omniana, which was a book, I don't know of any of these dates, but it was a book designed to teach you enough of everything that you could be a presence at a cocktail party.
Yeah.
That was the idea of the book Omniana. I think we need something like that today. There is a common fungus which so exactly represents the pole and cap of liberty that it seems offered by nature herself as the appropriate emblem of Gallic republicanism. Mushroom patriots with a mushroom cap of liberty. Inspiring. Psilocybe cyanescens. This was one that I actually had quite a bit of in my garden at one point. It took over a couple of my gardens when I used some fresh hardwood mulch. Grows particularly well on hardwood mulch. The wavy caps, Psilocybe cyanescens. We found them on Cortez while we were there. Commonly found in mulches. They also form stable populations in clearings with older trees from kind of waste places and rubus species, and are very potent. For those unfamiliar, the bluing of magic mushrooms is an actual direct measure of the amount of psilocybin in them. So a very potent mushroom like this blues very strongly. I remember when I was at UBC, at one point the people who maintained the gardens on campus, I suppose were tired of weeding them all the time and decided that they could cut their work in half by simply replacing all of the soil with bark mulch. And it grew huge amounts of Psilocybe cyanescens, and their poor plants all got trampled. And didn't work out as they had hoped. This is the beautiful Psilocybe azurescens, named by Paul Stamets after his son. Not after the color azure, but his son was named after the color that you so often find in magic mushrooms. Originates around Astoria, Oregon. Grows in the sand dunes near the mouth of the Columbia River. Certainly has been transplanted deliberately to British Columbia and cultivated in the lower mainland, also on Vancouver Island, also on some of the Gulf Islands, and again is very potent and blues very easily. Psilocybe baeocystus. This is one that's kind of expanded out from Vancouver as suburban development sprawled along the Fraser Valley. So you used to find it fairly close to downtown Vancouver on bark mulch. But as Vancouver's kind of sprawled in its cancerous fashion over much of the Fraser Valley, the range of baeocystus has moved outwards to that kind of urban-rural interface where there's lots of mulch still for it. It's been interesting to watch. Cyanofibrillosa is found both in wild places, like tangled shrubs, roots of shrubs and trees, in flood zones of rivers, but also in wood chip mulch in landscape areas. And again, we found this one last week. We found so many magic mushrooms on Cortez Island. I can't believe it. It's like they were everywhere. The common mushrooms. Psilocybe stutzi, one of the few magic mushrooms that has a ring that it maintains through adulthood. So now haven't I?
Just click somewhere else on the screen besides that menu.
There we go. Thank you very much. common weed species of urban and suburban landscapes. Sometimes in large quantities. It's a bit of a problem, but not many people seek this one out because the potency is low, and also there's a number of species of mushrooms in the genus Galerina that oftentimes feature rings around the stem that can resemble Studesii. So most people that I know of steer clear of this species, even though it can be abundant sometimes. Thymetaria, a rare European species that also features a rim and can be confused with Studesii. And Folliculosa, which generally grows in forests, so it's an odd one. And we found lots of this, actually in a number of the Gulf Islands this year, growing in forests. It resembles some of the little brown mushrooms. I don't know if I spoke derisively today about LBMs that are hard to identify. And it also resembles some Galerina species, so I don't know anybody who goes out hunting specifically for Psilocybe folliculosa. It's definitely a native species that can show up in cities. And then there are a few species in different genera that contain psilocybin. Canossebe cyanopus, common lawn mushroom. They don't contain a lot of psilocybin, and they don't really look like magic mushrooms like a lot of other ones. Again, I don't know anybody who collects these, but they do contain those mushrooms. And Gymnophilus, we found a lot of Gymnophilus today growing on wood. This is the species we didn't find today that's called aeruginosus because an awful lot of it is blue for the psilocybin that it contains. And this is one that usually shows up at our annual mushroom show around Victoria. And we put it on the table for everyone to see. And by the end of the day, it's always gone. Like some of the Gymnophilus we collected today, it's got a very bitter taste, but a beautiful spore print.
Yeah.
Yeah. Panaeolus subboltiatus. There's a common Panaeolus that grows that I saw today here on this island called Panaeolus phenicecii, the haymaker's mushroom, that is reported in a number of books to contain psilocybin. It doesn't, but this one does and is oftentimes found around stables. So there's a few mushrooms that contain psilocybin. Now, there is an historical record in different countries of the use of magic mushrooms for divination and other purposes. A couple of examples here from Mexico, but there are cave paintings, for example, from Algeria that may go back 5,000 years or more, depicting the use of what appears to be magic mushrooms. Certainly in some of these old Mexican documents, you can see, for example, this fellow up here with the mushrooms.
I brought some wavy cats home recently, and our male cat was nibbling on it. I had to take it away from him. I don't know if he was going to go full tilt or not, but I had to take it away.
Well, I think it's probably best just to confine cats to microdosing.
Yeah.
I do know it.
Actually, his name is lion's mane in Japanese. His name is Yamabushitake. Yeah, that's what we use.
I mean, it's interesting to think about it the other way around because there's been quite a lot of speculation in the literature about why magic mushrooms contain psilocybin. And mostly plants contain compounds to deter grazing. But this wouldn't necessarily deter grazing. But there was a recent paper that suggested that the problem was that people were thinking about magic mushrooms in terms of the effect that they had on humans and other mammals. And if you looked at a number of grazing insects, the effect of psilocybin is to depress appetite. It's not an hallucinogen at all, in which case it kind of makes sense for the mushrooms to have that. Anyway, let's see if I can avoid screwing up this time. Oh, yes, so that was just the second one showing what can happen to people who consume these magic mushrooms. There is being visited by God of some sort. Needless to say, the use of magic mushrooms as hallucinogens was suppressed brutally by the Spanish conquerors, and was not available to the public for a long period of time until this article by Robert Gordon Lawson, a banker and amateur ethnographer, I suppose, who went down to Mexico and published in Life magazine, the leading magazine of the day, an article entitled "Seeking the Magic Mushroom." Incidentally, that seems to be the first time that anybody could find the phrase magic mushroom used. And he encountered a woman named Maria Sabina who helped he and others use the magic mushrooms. And he and his wife Valentina recorded, "We were never more wide awake, and the visions came whether our eyes were open or closed. They emerged from the center of the field of vision, opening as they came, now rushing, now slowly at the pace our will chose. They were in vivid color and always harmonious. They began with art motifs, angular, such as might decorate carpets of textiles or wallpaper of the drawing board of an architect. Later, it was as if the walls of our house had been dissolved, and my spirit had flown forth, and I was suspended in midair viewing landscapes of mountains, with camel caravans advancing slowly across the slope, the mountains rising tier above tier to the very heavens. It seemed as though I was viewing a world of which I was not a part, and which I could not hope to establish contact. There I was, poised in space, a disembodied I, invisible, incorporeal, seeing but not seen." Needless to say, that was a smash hit in Life magazine. So within 2 years of publication of that article, the renowned chemist Albert Hoffman had isolated, characterized, and synthesized psilocybin and psilocin. And Sandoz had patented the extraction procedure and a method for therapeutic tranquilization, marketing pills under the trade name Indocybin. And right away, there started a huge amount of research into the use of this new compound to treat various psychiatric ailments, addictions, and so forth. That continued really until the mid-60s or so, until the war on drugs, when this rich and really promising literature on the use of psilocybin was shut down summarily. So there are psychoactive psilocybe species in an awful lot of the world, including our part of the world. See, and it wasn't long before people realized, people followed Lawson's trail down to Mexico, but it wasn't long before people realized you could find a lot of these mushrooms on the west coast of North America. And here's UBC, and this is the first record that we know of for the arrest of someone outside of Mexico for possession of magic mushrooms. Was on the UBC campus in 1965. So talk about a cool BC connection. Yeah.
So just for clarification, it's the first record of the arrest or of the use?
Of arrest. Which is probably the first record of use too. But I don't know. If you know of others, that would be great. But oftentimes, careful records of use of magic mushrooms weren't kept unless people were actually arrested. Anyway, a 1967 reference says that the students ate them, quote, for psychotomimetic effects, or that is to induce an effect similar to psychosis. I suspect they were actually eating them to get high.
Yeah.
The RCMP were eventually involved, and so this is the first record that we're aware of the use of these mushrooms in North America outside of Mexico. And certainly the first arrest, I would love to hear if there are other records of their use. But however it works out, I'd say BC has a pretty central role here.
Mhm.
Here's a letter from 1964 from Alexander Smith, the grand old man of American mushroom science from the University of Michigan, to my supervisor, Bandoni. This was in Bandoni's records. He says, I shall be happy to check your psilocybe species, so send them along with all the notes you have. So as early as the year before, Bandoni, the mycologist at UBC, was sending psilocybe species down to Alexander Smith for identification. It's kind of interesting. And here is a letter from Smith again. I have examined your specimen. It appears to be psilocybe semi-lanceolata without doubt. Okay, so that's a Liberty cap identified in 1965, not long before those students were arrested on campus. So by the early 1970s, many areas in British Columbia, including Haida Gwaii, had become well known for having productive Liberty cap fields. And we're attracting large numbers of pickers from across Canada. This is in 1980, not far from the Tsawwassen Ferry Terminal. And in late 1974, psilocybin possession was prohibited when it was added to the list of restricted substances in Canada's Food and Drug Act. The arrest began. So this is the year, the number of convictions, and the provinces. And you can see BC's got a pretty high percentage of the arrests each year, but an awful lot of those were from people coming from other provinces to British Columbia to pick magic mushrooms. And a number of the arrests, in other provinces are of people who had returned to their home province with BC magic mushrooms. So BC was playing a pretty prominent role at the time. And you saw it in the popular culture in British Columbia at the time. The Georgia Straight was the preeminent counterculture publication at the time, and here are some covers from 1974 and 1975. There were lots of fine books around in those days. These are all books about psilocybin mushrooms and about how to grow them. And let me see here. This one here was actually written by one of our fellow graduate students in the Department of Botany at the time for 10 Speed Press in Berkeley. It was one of the classic tome of the time. He was one of the authors under a pseudonym. It's kind of necessary at the time.
Yeah.
And then, in late 1979, BC Appeals Court ruled that possession of mushrooms in their natural state did not constitute possession of the restricted compound per se. So psilocybin was disallowed, but there was only one laboratory in British Columbia that could identify psilocybin, and it was overwhelmed. A Massachusetts resident had been charged with possession of psilocybin after several containers of mushrooms were seized from her home, but she was acquitted. And the Crown appeal of this acquittal was dismissed by the appeals court, and so starting in 1979, it became not illegal to possess magic mushrooms. That was the same year I started my master's. So between 1979 and 1982, it was not illegal to possess magic mushrooms in Canada. I have to tell you a funny story. So I've been carrying this picture of Paul around. This is not the same Paul who I put this talk together with. This is another Paul. I won't mention his last name, but I've been carrying this picture around with me forever because I had hoped to include it in an essay on magic mushrooms because, I mean, just look at the picture. Yeah, perfect. And of course I had his permission to use it. In fact, he was delighted it was being used. And he called me up this spring and he only had a poor version of the photo and he wanted the full resolution individual because his son was writing a book report about his dad. And his picture was Paul and his brothers were also involved in the fane of the Psilocybe Mushroom Association in 1979. A fane is a temple or a shrine. I actually like their previous name, which was Make All Psychedelics Legal Everywhere, or MAPLE,
Nice.
which is kind of Canadian. So we took out a copy of the old constitution of this organization and went especially to item D here. They were already assuming that it would become illegal again, so they were looking at disseminating the fact that all mushrooms of the genus Psilocybe are sacraments, that their ingestion is an aid to enlightenment and a religious practice, therefore protected by the Canadian Bill of Rights under freedom of religion.
Oh, yeah. True.
And then there were all kinds of clashes. So even though it was not illegal to possess magic mushrooms, people were still usually trespassing on farmers' fields to get them and causing all kinds of problems for the farmers. So there were disputes all over the province and arrests, not for possession, but for trespass and damage and things like that. Well, boy, that's a good mustache, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So as I say, 1979 to 1982 were the years when it wasn't illegal. And those are also the years when I was doing my master's at UBC. They were a little fuzzy. That's nice. I worked closely with a fellow graduate student and the author, co-author under a pseudonym of That Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide to grow a whole bunch of magic mushrooms in the growth chamber in the botany department at UBC. And the botany department was as straight-laced as you can possibly imagine. Ken's over here nodding his head. But they agreed to this because my friend was going to study the biosynthesis of the hallucinogenic compounds. But we had to have a fairly large number of mushrooms. Fortunately, he was one of the best people to grow those mushrooms, so I helped them out, but they only agreed to it if the RCMP would come in each week and count the mushrooms. And the RCMP agreed to do that, and they came in each week, and we would meet with the RCMP, and we would go to this growth chamber, and they would spend an hour counting the mushrooms coming out of each of the mason jars of mushrooms. And so long as it was roughly the same as the week before, they were okay. I don't think we ever explained to them that they weren't the same mushrooms. But yeah, it was a time. One of my favorite stories of the time that was told to me by a picker, which I think is apocryphal because I've heard the same story from other places, was about a friend of his who had allegedly eaten magic mushrooms and was driving home over the Lions Gate Bridge in Vancouver. It's a very bad idea.
Oh, yeah.
And the sun was setting at the time, which made it worse because one of the effects of the visual distortion that can accompany the use of psilocybin is to take something like a sunset and make it a lot more spectacular. And apparently the fellow was doing this and was a little nervous, and he looked in his rearview mirror and he saw flashing lights. And he realized he was in trouble. Thought, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do here? Police are after me, 50 kilometers an hour. I must be exceeding the speed limit. But if I say I was really exceeding it, then he'll know that I'm really stoned. So the policeman pulled him over and he said, "Do you know how fast you were going?" And the fellow said, 62 miles an hour. I guess it was before kilometers. 62 miles per hour. The policeman said, "You were going 11 miles an hour." So near the end of 1982, the Supreme Court of Canada ended the anomaly of magic mushrooms being legal while the hallucinogen in them, so that psilocybin is not. Don't want to get into the legal details, but it was the end of the legality of magic mushrooms, and they remain illegal to this day. Right? And we don't see the level of problems that we saw before, I think in large part because although field collection is still important in some parts of the province in some seasons, for the most part, it's really easy to grow magic mushrooms at home, and that's what a lot of people do. Okay, so it gets away from the sorts of conflicts we were seeing before. And in general, even though it remains illegal to this day, it's not a crime that gets prosecuted in British Columbia. At least not regularly and systematically. Here from a festival in Vancouver, all these booths selling shrooms. In fact, there are magic chocolates and all other kinds of things. I guess I really knew it was going mainstream with Visa, MasterCard, American Express. And the square, yes. But I want to just very quickly go back to the late 50s, early 60s. There was an incredible amount of really promising research into the use of psilocybin for various purposes, but especially treatment of psychiatric disorders. It was turning up some really promising results. And then it all got shut down and no research took place really for 30 years. Till it picked up again in the late 1990s, which is a shame because psilocybin is currently being investigated for treatment of anxiety disorders, major depressions, fear of death and dying, and treatment of addictions. I'm not going to deal too much with that because that's not the topic of my talk tonight, but it's really interesting if you like the writing of Michael Pollan, for example, check out his book, How to Change Your Mind, which is a really good summary of a lot of this work. And some of the results of these trials are simply astounding in terms of the treatment successes they're finding in individuals who were entirely resistant to any other form of treatment. So it's really an exciting area of research and treatment right now. And it's really interesting when you're talking about the psychedelics. This is a chart that shows the ratio of the active dose to the lethal dose. So how much does it take of something to be active divided by how much does it take to be lethal? If those two are fairly close, then you're in big trouble. So you want a low number there. And dependence potential, what's the chance you become addicted to a substance? Here's LSD and psilocybin down here. Right? You're certainly in an awful lot more peril if you're a user of something like caffeine or alcohol. Right? And then this is just an email from a fellow named Michael Butte, who's a mycologist from the Pacific Northwest. And it's not an email. It's what is it? A Facebook post? Yeah, I think. And I just found it incredibly moving. He said, on Friday night, September 16th, I gave a talk at the White Salmon, Washington Grange on psilocybin mushrooms as entheogens, that is, revealers of the God within. I've given versions of the talk from Alaska to Los Angeles and east to Wisconsin, but always to mushroom clubs or at mushroom forays. The question has always been intellectual. This time, many in the audience came because they or a friend had terminal cancer. I looked out to see gaunt faces, sometimes wondering whether it was the wife or the husband with the cancer. I listened and ate for people wondering how they could get access to psilocybin treatment for end-of-life anxiety. I so wanted to help, but could not tell them who to turn to guide them on an end-of-life trip. Anyway, it goes on and on here. Today, walking alone in my beloved old growth forest, I cried in sympathy and in frustration at legislators who keep this incredible, non-addictive, life-saving medicine illegal. And he goes on here and ends, always remember that psilocybin was made illegal mainly because it increased empathy in people. It made people more caring about each other. That caring was interfering with the conduct of the Vietnam War. That's Michael's view, but it's not entirely inaccurate, and I think it's very timely. And I just found this really profound and moving statement from a friend. In Vancouver, There are mushroom dispensaries open on the downtown east side. I found it wonderful news to read in the newspaper where some right-wing city councilor said, "Why don't you shut these down?" And the police responded, "In case you haven't noticed, we're dealing with much bigger problems on the downtown east side." Right? Anyway, thanks very much for your time.
So we're running kind of late, but it
Well, sorry.
would be nice to, not your fault, Danny. But it would be nice to have a little bit of time for questions. Are you going to?
Oh, yeah, sure. Why don't we do a couple of questions, and then if people want to talk about it afterwards, we'll let everybody else go home and you can come up here and we can chat about it. Yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask about the obvious one around here that I've only seen, the Amanita, and how does it relate to?
Okay. Yeah, I didn't include Amanita in this list because in my experience in Western North America, although occasionally people will have hallucinations following quite a lot of poisoning
Right.
and venting their digestive system at both ends, more often than not, people just vent their digestive system at both ends. And in a province blessed with so many gentle hallucinogens, I didn't even want to dwell on the topic. That's different from Amanita muscaria in Eastern Europe, where it has been used for centuries or probably millennia as an hallucinogen. But I think it's got different chemical constituents, at least in my experience in Western North America.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was one photo that had a dude carved in the Haida style
Yes.
as a mushroom.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have seen any traces in traditional indigenous art or record of use, or if that's just not your domain.
It is my domain to a minor extent. I would refer you to a paper by Nancy Turner and another fellow. Do you remember his name?
Get it inside.
Yeah. That came out last year, which was basically a survey across Canada of ethnomycology, traditional use of fungi. But compared with, say, the field of ethnobotany, it's almost nothing, and tends to run towards the use of some fungi for spiritual and shamanic purposes, and a few species for eating, but almost nothing at all. It suggests to me that either the fungi weren't used all that much, or that they weren't willing to tell the ethnographers about them. Though they told the ethnographers about some pretty important uses of plants. It's entirely possible, one of my theories at least, is that a lot of our best edible mushrooms arrive about the same time as the salmon in the streams around here. How are you going to spend your time?
Yeah.
Okay, well that's probably great. If anybody has any more questions or anything they want to talk about, I'll be around for a little while afterwards.